Good morning, my name's Colin. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this Responsible Business Making Business Mutual Forum. And before we go any further, I'd like you to all stand up, shake the hands of your neighbours on either side and say congratulations on getting here on time.
We were on time.
All right, thank you. All right, thanks very much. The purpose of that was first of all to wake you up, secondly to tell you about Mutuality, and to suggest to you that you're not just going to be couch potatoes and you're going to be active during the whole of this forum. Samuel Huntington, in his book On the Clash of Civilizations, talked about race and religion, culture and creed, countries and continents, and the West and the rest. But he left out probably the most important institution in our lives. It's an institution that clothes, feeds, and houses us, that employs us and invests our savings. It's the source of economic prosperity and the growth of nations around the world. At the same time, it's been the source of terrible deprivation, poverty, and environmental degradation. And the problems are getting worse. And the reasons that they are getting worse is that corporations are getting bigger, to the point that many of them are larger than their nation states. And as nations find themselves increasingly unable to service their public sector debt, they turn to corporations to provide the services that previously they offered. But at the same time as this is happening, corporations are losing our trust. Initially, we just associated that with the financial sector, but increasingly we've come to realize it's associated with everything, from energy to automobiles, from food to pharmaceuticals. But at the same time, technological changes offer greater opportunities for corporations to be able to contribute to real benefits to us as customers and communities. Just look at what's happened in China in terms of the growth of China in relation to its corporations, or in Japan in the high growth era, or the remarkable development of Korea on the back of its family-owned firms, as in India and in Singapore. But at the same time, those Chinese corporations have been associated with terrible environmental degradation. The Japanese firms with the collapse of the banking system, the Korean firms with lots of social issues and problems, and in India, unsustainable levels of inequality. And more seriously, in Africa and in the Middle East, the absence of indigenous large corporations is associated with many of the social and economic problems in that area. And closer to home, we're outraged by the egregious levels of inequality between those at the top and those at the bottom of corporations, the failure of corporations to pay their fair share of taxes, the fact that they still employ slave labor in their supply chains and in sweatshops around the world, and the environmental degradation associated with it. It's remarkable that the corporation can be the explanation of both the success and failure of nations, the environmental degradation and the solution to that, and social networks and the creation of social problems. And with globalization, we find ourselves losing our sense of identity and community. Technology is depriving us of our jobs and livelihood, and financialization is making us focused on just one sense of self-worth, and that's how much money we make. And the reason that this is happening is that we've lost trust in our corporations to look after us as individuals, not just as customers and communities or employees, but as individuals and humans. And the reason that this is happening is that we've taken humanity out of the corporation. Increasingly, it's being controlled not by men, but by machines, and in particular, markets. Adam Smith was very careful to balance the emphasis that he placed on markets and the wealth of nations with morality and a theory of moral sentiment. But we've lost that balance in emphasizing economic efficiency over ethics. Restoring trust in corporations is probably one of the most important issues of this decade, because without it, corporations will continue to decline, economies will continue to collapse, and civilizations will continue to clash. But with it, we can achieve greater levels of economic and social prosperity than we have done to date, because ultimately a moral corporation is a commercially successful corporation, and the competitiveness of nations depends on the moral fiber of our corporations. And key to that moral fiber is this concept of mutuality that we're going to be talking about over the next day and a half. It is a way of recognizing us as individuals, as humans, within our communities, within our firms, as customers, as suppliers in the chain. But the question is, are companies really behaving in a mutual way? Will they behave in a mutual way? What does it take for them to do that? How can we judge whether or not they've really succeeded in doing what they potentially can do? Well, over the next day and a half, you should get answers to those questions. And if you fail to get answers to those questions, you should complain to me and to my co-director of the Oxford Mars program, Bruno Roche. Bruno is the chief economist at Mars and director of Mars's think tank, Mars Catalyst. And it's my great pleasure to welcome my colleague and great friend, Bruno Raj.
Well, thank you very much, Colin, for this kind introduction. I'm sorry you will have to cope with my French accent for the next 2 days, but I hope it will not prevent you from understanding our sense of vision and purpose and heart for what we are doing. So again, good morning, everyone. My name is Bruno Raj. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to welcome you. I heard that there are more than 285 students who have registered for this conference, which actually is apparently a very high proportion. I also know that you guys coming from very different backgrounds, different geographies, different walk of life, but with one purpose that unites all of us, which is to position our business schools, our next business, our organizations as a force for good for society. So as Colin said in his introduction, the role of business has been so pervasive over the last 50 years. It's like the elephant in the room. Actually, the elephant in the kitchen. It's so big that nobody sees it. The problem is that this elephant has become dysfunctional. And to some extent, it's bringing a lot of confusion in our society. Civilizations, you talk about the clash of civilization, civilizations don't last forever. And very often disappear because of the selfishly focus on their short-term needs and wants. And the analogy with today's world is that today, short-term profit maximization is a norm versus a long-term vision to be mutual. So it's pretty clear to us, at least, that business is part of the problem. But business can be part of the solution. And actually, the purpose of this forum is to introduce a concept that the idea is that business must be part of the solution. I would like to share a small anecdote. When I met Colin several years ago with Peter Tufano, the dean of this institution, we visited this campus. And I was intrigued by one particular artifact in this building, which is the big tower over there. And I asked Peter, what is this? And he said, well, people call it the ziggurat, which is actually the Tower of Babel. And I was very intrigued because Babel means confusion in Semitic languages. And the Tower of Babel is essentially the attempt for human beings to rise up to confusion. And I was intrigued because what we're doing here today and what we've been doing for the last 3 years with Oxford is essentially to confuse the confusion. To invade Babylon with knowledge, with purpose, with action. A great thinker of the antiquity said that my people perish because of lack of knowledge. So the purpose of the next 2 days is a humble approach to bring some knowledge to existing and future business leaders, to confuse the confusion, and to invade this Babylonian world. I've been working for Mars for the last 26 years. And 10 years ago, 10 years ago, we had an amazing discussion, which actually triggered this journey. It came from the top management and the shareholder of Mars. We said, well, what should be the right level of profit? It was a remarkable question at the time, for at least 3 reasons. First of all, because it was posed by a corporation, a shareholder, not a philanthropist, not an NGO, not the government. It was remarkable because it happened 18 months before the crisis in the financial markets, which actually started to shake our trust in the financial capitalism system. It is a remarkable question because it was posed in a business context, expecting a business answer, not a charity or a type of CSR type of answer. It was particularly interesting for me as a person. At the time, I just became the head of Catalyst, and I've always been interested in my life in the relationship between values and value, between actually also value systems, religion, culture, and economic development. And I've been always fascinated by the work of Max Weber, the great sociologist, who theorized the concept of the Protestant ethics and the spirit of capitalism. And we had a chance also to work with Peter Berger at the very early stage of this journey, and he shared with me something I never forgot. He said, value systems or religion shape culture, and culture shape economic development. So not every value system is conducive to economic development. Not every culture is conducive to economic development. And there are some natural laws that's coming from the world of sociology and philosophy that actually explain why certain countries, certain corporations fail and others succeed. So it has a profound impact on me, very personally. So this question of righteousness in the business context opens a number of questions. Some are very pragmatic, like is there a relationship between growth and profits? And if there is a relationship, which one drives what? Is it profit that drives growth or growth that drives profit? But it also opens some moral questions. So what is the principle that can justify the level of profits that one can take? What is the moral principle that can justify how much money or wealth can be accumulated by a number of people? So it's not a new question, actually. Not a new question. It's a quote from King Solomon, 950 years before Christ, and said, one person gives freely and yet gains more, and another withholds what is right and only to become poor. So 3,000 years ago, there was already the thinking that values and wealth, values and value creation are connected. But over the last 50 years, it was responded in a very different way, in a very specific way. Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize laureate, who he's considered the father of modern capitalism and financial capitalism, said eventually the sole social responsibility of business is to maximize its profit for the benefit of its shareholders. But it's not really quite the Mars way. And at Mars, the founder of the company defined the objective of the company in a letter that has been famous at Mars in 1947, and I'd like to read it. An interesting bit in this vision is that the shareholders are the last. And this is what defines mutuality at Mars. I'd like to add also that this question has been largely ignored in economics and management. It's actually a blind spot in the literature. So when we started the journey with academics and a few friends, we decided to have a triple perspective: a moral perspective, because of the relationship between values and value creation, that was our intuition; an academic perspective, because we had to feel and develop a completely new set of knowledge; but also a very business perspective, because at the end of the day, at Mars, we are selling candies, we are selling chewing gums, we are selling pet food. So we are extremely down-to-earth people. So we started the journey 10 years ago with many failures, but some great success. And I hope that this forum, which will present a subset of the outcome of the last 10 years of research, will be one of the latter. Thank you. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Clara Sheng, the soulmate of this project. She's been working with me at Catalyst for the last 6 or 7 years now. She's a global director for emerging market and Asia for Catalyst, and she will be the master of ceremony for the rest of the day. Thank you, Clara.
Thanks. Good morning. Good morning and welcome. And it's been such a pleasure to work with Bruno and Colin these last few years, and if they've shared, business has had a greater positive impact on more people and more quickly than any other human creation. But profit maximization is eroding this. And next, I'd like to introduce 2 students, Oxford MBA students, Maren Mende and Xue Yan. And they will illustrate the Western and Eastern perspective. Please come up, Maren and Yan. Yes. So handing it over to you for a Western and Eastern perspective on the global landscape.
Thank you. I have a confession to make. I am a banker. But people who join the industry nowadays are no longer in it for the money itself. Many of us have heard Simon Sinek's interview on millennials in the workplace, explaining how millennials are looking for purpose, impact, quick wins, instant gratification. They're no longer used to having to wait for anything. Well, yes, we're not used to waiting for anything anymore. But maybe we're also sick of waiting. Sick of waiting for corporations to create an environment in which we can have impact. Sick of waiting for business to do well and do good. Sick of waiting for the current era of split logic, of business versus social, to end. And there has been change in how business tackles responsibility. It's definitely evolving, but there's still so much talk and so little action. And when the business-social marriage doesn't work, it's always the business logic that trumps. Case studies of where the mutuality of business has worked are still few and far between. There are still so many events, not unlike this one, where corporations come together to hear the latest thinking on responsible business, showcase their success stories, and commit to actions that are then impossible to measure or implement. We've seen a steady evolution over the last 30 years or so, first slow, then at ever-increasing speed, from philanthropy to CSR to sustainability and shared value, and to most recently, doing good by doing well, and now doing well by doing good. After the financial crisis, the initially slow and gradual change rapidly became exponential. We suddenly moved from self-interest to shared interest, and creating shared value is one of the innovations of this movement. But none of the recent changes have truly challenged the consumerism we are a slave to. None have fully integrated social and business initiatives to the extent that they are truly complementary and indeed mutual partners in corporate life. During my career over the last 5 years or so, I have witnessed some of the fastest pace of change in this business practice evolution, and I'm utterly convinced that we are on the cusp of realizing the latest goal. With a final push, we can shift the majority of the business world towards a more sustainable, mutual model in the near future too. We can finally fully understand the benefits and burdens everyone shares. We can work towards achieving a balance under which everyone flourishes. So I've been reflecting on what's holding us back from making this new way of doing business the norm. What are the barriers preventing us from making this final push and preventing the vast majority of corporations from catching up with a few leaders in the pack? And as I share my thoughts, allow me to draw parallels to the corporate, specifically banking world that I know. Not to address the cliche of the bad banker, but because it's my career home and what I know from the commercial banking side and the CSR side. And because the barriers I encountered firsthand are not alien to the corporate world. So firstly, corporate culture and middle management. In 2012, I designed and managed a sustainable agricultural supply chain solution in Ghana for an international drinks manufacturer on behalf of the bank I was working for at the time. The project was both commercial for the bank and the drinks manufacturer, and from a social impact perspective, helped over 6,000 farmers gain access to financial services and agricultural and business skills training. The project was awarded a Citizenship Award, and with that, everyone wanted in on the action. Everyone wanted to shake the CEO's hand, they wanted to hold the shiny award. Well, they say success has many fathers. Until then, the team and I had learned what it meant to fight corporate bureaucracy and common sense, and struggled to convince our superiors that long-term social impact and commerciality could trump short-term monetary gain on its own. My immediate managers were impossible to convince. My CEO was supportive of the initiative and made public commitments to remove those employees who did not act with long-term sustainability and responsibility in mind. But my manager wanted to see numbers, and he wanted to see them instantly. Both he and I were measured on short-term figures, not our long-term actions. Sure, you have metrics tables at the end of the year that you can fill out when your performance is reviewed, and you can tick the citizenship or CSR box. But there's clearly an incoherence between the message from the top, the CEOs in the limelight, and the new millennial employees who are eager to put this message, which is so aligned to their hunger for impact, into action. And the barrier between them is middle management, the guys in between who need to deliver the numbers and are fearing for their established jobs in an ever uncertain environment. The guys with a more risk-averse attitude, with personal commitments that require job stability. They ultimately kill off any budding opportunity, or in their eyes risk, to work with long-term goals in mind. And frustratingly, they don't yet see the commercial social synergy. For them, it's either or. And that's very much culture-driven. Look at the term CSR. We all know that CSR, citizenship, sustainability, these are outdated labels, or at least concepts that carry negative connotations with them. And I have seen how this manifests itself in practice. After my aforementioned project management job, I took on a role on the bank's social innovation team. A role intended to straddle the business and social side of the organization. A great idea, but with one major flaw. It resided in the citizenship bank part of the bank, and with that, it was doomed. The minute you mentioned you were associated with citizenship in the organization, you became one of those, from the floor, which was 99% occupied by women, with cake and family photographs. You were not part of the real bank, the bank where you make money, and where, and I was told this by my former managers, time spent laughing is less time spent working. I had moved to what my former corporate and investment banking colleagues and friends described as a mere cost center. And when I later took a job on the business side of the bank again, I was told by one manager not to worry, we would get my career back on track. He did not see the value my social innovation experience would bring. He did not see how knowledge of creating new socially and commercially viable products and services for the bank could be relevant to his fast-paced, high-growth business unit. Returning to the business was almost as eye-opening as leaving it. When I spent my evenings in bars and pubs with primarily male colleagues in an attempt to be accepted again, I started to hear the real stories, their thoughts not polished in case someone overheard, and I started to understand. These people are not bad people. They are fathers, charity board members, people who voluntarily coach children's sports at weekends when they have weekends and are not in the office. These are people who want to do good. That millennial way of thinking is not that alien to them. But they do good through philanthropy. For some inexplicable reason, it's unacceptable to do good by doing well in a business setting. But it is acceptable to spend a couple of hours painting a school with your colleagues on Community Day and ticking that citizenship box as a result. Why? Why does this culture exist? I can only bring it back to the numbers. Bankers and many other corporate employees get measured on income and revenue, and the faster you generate that, the better. You work for 8 to 9 months between receiving your bonus in your bank account and submitting your end-of-year review, which, if positive, will result in your bonus being paid out again 3 to 4 months later. I don't want to make excuses for my former colleagues, and I'm definitely not trying to rally sympathy. But it's hard enough to achieve these growth goals at full pace, let alone if you're looking for longer-term social initiatives at the same time, especially since the latter may take some upfront time and financial investment. And yet, the more we focus on these short-term incentives, the more we do this at a surroundings expense, and the harder it gets to do the same again the following year. It's simply not sustainable. But no one wants to be, or can afford to be, the first to break that cycle. There's something inherently wrong with corporates, not just banks, cultures, which do not allow us to slow down, to think beyond short-term profits, that keep CSR departments separate and at a distance, and that do not see the value of integrating the two. And yet it is possible. We can make the numbers add up. We can do well by doing good, or good by doing well. And when we do, we will no longer experience marginal gains, but realize that there are multiple ways of doing well, and that doing well will no longer just be a euphemism for pure financial profitability. We are living in a dramatically changing world. Many nations are moving away from global mindsets, entering a time dominated by changing geopolitics and transitioning into the unknown. We don't yet know what model we are entering, but we do know that it is changing. And such a point of change is the perfect time to make changes in our business practices too. But middle management and its associated corporate culture is not the only thing holding us back. We're facing another significant barrier to achieving mutuality: measurement. In order for more businesses to think beyond immediate profit and make societal impact an essential part of their business, we need to address this issue on an international scale and move beyond private sector innovations in isolation. Companies are still, first and foremost, measured on financial performance. This is ultimately what's driving our middle management's number-focused behavior. And financial performance measurement is standardized. It's easy. And this standardization is the reason it works. It is why companies are able to compare and compete. Unfortunately, it took hundreds of years to come up with the standardization, though. And we are nowhere near achieving the same on the social side, and consequently, even further from integrating financial and social goals. Encouragingly, many companies are now reporting on sustainability and corporate responsibility targets. However, these efforts are often still in the form of nice-to-have sideline reports on soft, non-standardized measurements. Every company sets its own targets, and since it's both the target setter and measurer, it will inevitably meet those targets. Again, let me draw on my own experience. I have witnessed the almost random goal setting, picking round, impressive numbers in their millions of how many people the organization would like to reach through social initiatives. As the deadline to achieve this target by approached, measurement became increasingly inventive. Suddenly, one wasn't measuring the number of people who had actually achieved financial inclusion status as a result of a particular initiative, but estimating how many millions of people may have watched a TV advert which carried a social message. Where there is a will to achieve a goal, there is a way. And who can blame these organizations? There is no standardized approach, there is no precedent, and most importantly, there is no regulation. This is a voluntary act. There's currently a huge focus on achieving social impact, but it's all too easy to somehow tick this box and to keep this separate from financial impact. If we want to achieve equality between social and financial initiatives, they need to be treated in the same way. We need to stop thinking about them differently and separately. And if I may link this back to my earlier point on culture and middle management, we need to make changes before this point in the value creation supply chain too. By the same means by which we should align the way impact and outcomes are measured, we also need to align inputs, the way managers are incentivized and empowered to make decisions, paving an easier road towards creating mutual social and commercial impact. A move towards standardized social impact measurement and a formalized requirement for impact reporting, integrated with existing reports, would create the competitive environment that the private sector thrives on. If we want financial goals achieved through social good and social goals achieved through commercial activity to be just as respected and valued as commercial goals on their own, they need to be interwoven. We cannot continue to isolate them in separate reports with separate measurement standards. Businesses currently compete on financial metrics. If they have to measure social metrics and receive an incentive to do so, they may just as easily compete to be the best at meeting and exceeding social impact goals too. And I strongly believe that we need to move beyond private sector engagement to effect these changes. We need public sector governmental support and pressure if we truly want to succeed in this endeavor. That is to say, we need to not just have companies working with each other to achieve mutuality, we also need public-private sector collaboration. And both sides will benefit. After all, it is in government's interest to reduce the social burden on them too. First efforts have been made to analyze and standardize impact data, and this has primarily happened at national level, but it's not reflective of global business. Only an international G7 or G20 level agreement will really spark a culture change among international businesses, especially in light of the current political environment and potentially changing national standards. And this isn't blue sky thinking. It's perfectly possible. The world's political leaders continue to put important topics like climate change and labor and treatment of labor on their meeting agendas. But if they were to enforce that businesses make these topics part of their dealings and reporting, they may be able to address these challenges more effectively and sustainably. The world's economies could find themselves on a much more direct path to fairness if, for example, an international body were to be established to standardize social impact measurement, and if social impact reporting, aligned with financial reporting, became a regulatory requirement for multinational corporations, tightly tied to existing reporting standards. Consequently, the focus of such companies would shift from short-term to long-term profitability, and investment in social matters would no longer be predominantly government-owned, but would increasingly become a competitive advantage for private sector businesses. We would shift from the triple bottom line to a much-needed single bottom line, where everyone works together towards a single, unified, and unifying goal. So I stand here at Saïd Business School in the hope and knowledge that we can overcome these two barriers of middle management and measurement. And we can do so without waiting for the millennial generation to organically rise to positions of responsibility and decision-making power. I chose this business school because I truly believe that it provides the tools, both in terms of education and network, to equip us as potential future leaders to bring impact to business. Responsible business practices are woven through every course here, from accounting to corporate finance and marketing. And what I find most encouraging is that I know I'm surrounded by a cohort of students, friends, and faculty who feel and think the same way, and who will have the power, perhaps individually, but certainly collectively, as we spread out across industries and geographies at the end of our time here, to take business on that final step in its transformational journey to mutuality. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Yan, one of my inspirational fellow students, who will share her thoughts on this topic with particular emphasis on her home country, China.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yan, and I come from China. While I'm studying here, my family and friends keep asking me about my plan after Oxford. Before I could answer, they would say, "Don't come back to China." It is really rarely suggested to stay away from your home, but I understand their concern. Standing from afar and observing, in the most controversial and discussed nation, the most lucrative trade port for investors and speculators, an Asian civilization that has created economic miracles, I can only see lonely people, especially my generation. They are lonely because they spend evenings with work instead of with families. They are lonely because they live in the most expensive apartment with the worst environment. They spend their hard-earned money on things they don't need, and they can lose all their savings on medical and education bills. They are lonely because they cannot stop the expectation, and the irony is that in a society governed by communism, they are the people who have the lowest sense of security in the world. According to a research made by Berkeley Earth, 1.6 million Chinese died from air pollution each year. In the passing winter, more than 20 cities in China have been shrouded in smog. In mid-December 2016, Beijing authorities declared a 5-day pollution red alert for the first time. Schools were closed, cars were ordered off the road, and factories stopped operating. You can imagine what it's like in a modern city. But air pollution, as an obvious type of pollution, is actually not the most serious problem we are facing. In China, 64% of the underground water is seriously polluted, and 33% is mildly polluted, leaving only 3% of drinkable water. 75% of cities are short of water, and the availability of water each person is just 25% of the world's average. And 300 million people in the rural China, they are drinking contaminated water every day. And how about land that has fed 1.3 billion people, 16% of the farmland? That is 1 million square kilometers of soil, which equals to 4 times of the area of United Kingdom, is polluted. Obviously, the pressure of the people, the loneliness, the pollution, they have something to do with our economic development in the last 30 years. As the biggest beneficiary of globalization, our environment has also become the biggest victim. Long-term of trading plus means we are the world factory, and we have been exchanging renewable resources and clean air and water for money. But we all know one and the only truth about money: it's never enough. 160 years ago, opium came to China and destroyed a flourishing ancient China. And now, a new form of opium was brought to China again, and it is the culture of consumption. In China, rising living standard brings with it insatiable desire for more, bigger, and better. In the last 10 years, the vehicles on the road have increased by 8 times, from 37 million to 300 million. The average floor space per capita in the urban area is more than 33 square meters, and the number in UK just 44. And think about how close we are to the developed countries, and how we have achieved it with 20 times of the population. And think even harder about the sacrifice we have to make and the consequence we have to take. When 70% of our GDP growth is driven by consumption, my only question is, how long it's gonna last? But if you think this Chinese woman, empowering by the Oxford MBA, was criticizing and complaining, then you would be wrong, because Oxford doesn't teach me to criticize and complain. It teaches me to think from different perspectives, suggest solutions, and send messages. The most and the only important message I'm sending today is calling for 3 levels of mutuality. Mutuality in business, in terms of technology and expertise transfer. Mutuality among countries that is nurtured by integrity and trust and sincerity. And the mutuality between the environment and the people. When it comes to resources and environment, it is never the problem of one country. Currently, the consumption of natural resources like heavy metal and oil per capita in China by Chinese is only 9% of that of developed countries. Let's make a simple calculation. If the consumption of natural resources everywhere else in the world remains the same, and the consumption of Chinese reaches to the level of the people in a developed country, compared to the current situation, the consumption of natural resources on the earth, in the world, will be doubled, which means the environment impact it caused will be doubled. And nothing can stop this trend. As you know, everywhere in the world, in Europe, in China, Chinese customers are encouraged to buy and buy more. I'm personally against the consumption culture, but there are really useful and important things we should buy. For example, most of the ready-to-use anti-pollution technologies are in the hand of developed countries like America, Japan, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and they should be warmly welcomed by Chinese government and the Chinese investors. To be more specific, what we urgently need is anti-pollution technologies in the field of air pollution control, power plant emission reduction, water and wastewater treatment, and environmental consulting and engineering. In 2015, Chinese government amended the law and requests major emitters to install automated monitoring equipment and to publish their emission data. However, except for Beijing, no other cities have sufficient monitoring networks to establish the baseline for reductions or progress monitoring. Besides, there are definitely new business opportunities that is in industries that is subsidized by the Chinese government, like the renewable energy and electric cars. And with the growth of the purchasing power of Chinese people, we want a green lifestyle also, for ourselves and for our families. So green food and a green product will be very popular in China. When it comes to environment protection, the power of the government is far from enough. There are now more than 2,000 environment NGOs in China, but they are quite young and small, inexperienced, isolated, with little funding and low impact. And they want to partner with international NGOs to become more experienced and influential. What is the most effective way to raise up the awareness of the public? How to start a conversation with the government? And what kind of suggestions they can propose? How to talk to the companies? How to attract donations? And these are the questions you can help to figure out the answers. After talking about collaboration in technology and expertise, now let's talk about the meaning of mutuality in business and people. Since the opening up policy in China, we have attracted foreign direct investment of $1.7 trillion, which means that among the top 5 companies in each industry in China, there are foreign investors and companies as shareholders. Actually, Chinese market has become one of the biggest drivers of the world economy. But today, the structure and the order of the world is different from 160 years ago. Exploiting and depleting Chinese market is not the wise solution anymore. When it comes to wastes in production, working environment, impact on the surrounding area, China shall be encouraged to adopt standards in America and Europe, which are the highest standards of the world. Actually, the relevant country is not just China. Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Cambodia, the new cheap labor factories of the world can all learn the lesson. The intelligence of human beings are really amazing and memorable, especially when we are sitting here. But I always tell myself that when we are living the digital age, there are still places in the world without electricity. Driverless cars is amazing, especially for someone like me who doesn't have a license. But maybe our children, they prefer riding bicycles with us. Social media is powerful, but we are spending more time with strangers and caring about strangers instead of our families and real friends in real life. Big house, big pool, countless gadgets and brands, then who shall be the master of our life? I remember once I was at an event organized by a museum in Oxford, and the host asked, if you can take only one thing from the end of the world, what's going to be? My answer is humanity. And my friend laughed at me. Yes, I can be emotional, I can be dramatic, but it means nothing but arrogance and danger when intelligence lost this side of humanity, right? As MBAs, we shall be the new generation of leaders. We have seen the world, and we are sometimes confused and sometimes clear. But we shall never lose faith. So what are we going to do after Oxford? I think each of us will go to the place we called the home of our souls and use our skills and expertise to make changes. We will put more emphasis on sustainable development, employees' welfare, contributing to local communities, creating new jobs, and taking more social responsibilities. We are going to solicit help from our MBA classmates, Oxford alumni, coming from all over the world, and make all these changes. At the end of the message, I remember an interview given by Mr. Ding Zhongli, who is a distinguished Chinese geologist whose research field is prehistory climate studies. When asked how urgent it is to protect the planet, he said, "The planet doesn't need to be saved. There are times that the temperature of the Earth was 1,000 degrees higher than now, and the density of carbon dioxide was 10 times higher. The only thing that's going to disappear is species. So we are not saving the Earth, we are saving ourselves. Yes, we are nothing but a species on the Earth, but we are unique and a spectacular species. We laugh and cry, fight and make up. We complain and celebrate. We integrate and we disintegrate. Sometimes we are in despair, but I think most of the time we are full of hope. Though the history of human beings is just instant compared to the age of the universe, but in this self-redemption war, we can only win by standing shoulder by shoulder. And only by working together, our generation will never feel lonely again. Thank you.
Thank you, Maren and Nguyen. Maren for these strong reflections about, Maren speaking about middle management and metrics, preventing many people from being mutual and from doing what they would otherwise do. And also Nguyen, a very urgent and specific call to action for mutuality in business, mutuality among nations, and mutuality between the environment and people. And as we go into our next session, which are breakout sessions of case studies of companies that are approaching building mutuality into their business model, I'd also like to introduce Dr. Kate Roll, who's the Senior Director of Research at Saïd Business. Sorry, did I get that wrong? Did I get it wrong? Sorry, guys. I'm going to get this. I promoted her.
It's fine.
No, have I? Who is a Senior Research Fellow at Saïd Business School and who leads the Mutuality in Business Research at Oxford.
Perfect.
Thanks. I'm gonna share just a few words about the importance of the case studies that we're just going to embark on. So as Bruno mentioned, I work on emerging markets at Mars. And at Mars, we're relatively less strong in emerging markets. We don't reach the real mass market, the 4 billion people at the base of the pyramid. So when we were embarking on this work to build our own pilots in-house, which are now business units called MAWA in Kenya and Bloom in the Philippines, these are business units that support micro-entrepreneurs to distribute our goods, micro-distribution and micro-enterprises. Because we are not strong in these areas in the base of the pyramid, we were looking at what other companies were doing. So we learned a great deal from case studies from other multinationals like the Unilever Shakti program, the Danone Grameen, Danone Jita, both in Bangladesh, Nestle PPP, as well as case studies from within countries, like the Aravind eye care system or Dharma Life in India. So we looked across our case studies, and we looked for what are the key success factors, what helps makes a business successful or not. And what we learned was that charity doesn't work. So when you do a foundation or giveaway model, the charity dollar only has one life. That when companies went in and sought to maximize their profits, this was viewed as extremely exploitative. And the businesses that were succeeding in these contexts were using profit, growing with profit and a social purpose. So we took these lessons and we started building our own work, which continues to grow, these business units, social business units. And then we were really struggling with how to scale, and we observed this in the other social business too. The real challenge is to scale. And that's where all this work with Oxford is really helping us, is to formalize these lessons, so both the management practices and the metrics that we can draw on from others and from ourselves to scale. And from that, I'll hand it to Kate.
So even though Dean Tufano isn't here, I'm very happy to accept my promotion to the head of research for the business school. But actually, I'm just a research fellow on the Mutuality and Business Project, but I recognize a lot of faces here from my teaching with GoTo and a few other courses. One of the most stimulating things about coming to the business school from other parts of Oxford, I'm trained as a political scientist, is this push to take ideas into practice. And this just constant drive to say, okay, what does this actually mean? What does this look like in action? And so each year with this forum, and this is our second year, the organizing committee gets pushed to move beyond theory, beyond nice words, nice ideas, and say, find us examples of companies out there that are doing this. And not only just find nice social enterprises, find us big companies that are doing this. And it's actually really hard. This actually is a lot of work and a lot of vetting, and going through and finding cases that really fit our criteria of business model approaches that are solving real social, environmental, and business problems within an ecosystem. And so I'm tremendously happy that we have such important companies, some of the most important companies in the world, with us today to directly teach about what they've been doing. So all these different cases that are presented in the next parallel sessions are at different sizes, at different stages. They use different language than Mutuality, and that's just fine. But what we're really looking for is those threads that connect these, the practices that we can pull from them, and to really understand and grow our knowledge about this type of business. We've now got about 20, 25 cases that really look at these practices, and it's becoming a rich source of information. We see clusters around these cases, too. We see some cases that are enacting mutuality through extending the boundaries of the firm, through inclusivity. So bottom-of-the-pyramid approaches are a very good example of this. So there's a cluster around that, but we also see another cluster around sort of introspective practices, where companies are going back and looking at their own processes, looking at their own supply chains, and thinking about how do we do this better? How do we treat people better? How do we build these stronger? And so that's really, we're seeing themes and connections around these two sets. And I think the final thing I want to say, and this is sort of my duty as an academic, and also in recognition of what it means to be at Oxford and to have this on our badges, to be in this room, is that there's a duty for the students to ask hard questions, to really push, really get in there and try to understand. And then there's also an equal and reciprocal duty on the presenters to teach. You're in an academic institution, teach these cases, teach the hard bits, and really share what you've learned. So I'm incredibly excited about the next sessions, about these parallel sessions, about getting stuck into the details, and I hope they're really stimulating. So I'll hand back to Clara.
Yeah, so learning from the successes and failures of others is fundamentally what we're trying to do. Is we send you to these breakout sessions. Logistical note, there's a refreshment break now. There will be 5 sessions in parallel from 10:15 to 11:30. So at 10:15, please be in your rooms. You have room locations behind me in your manuals, and there will be instructions outside. And if you're in the Danone interface session, which is number 2, Classroom 2 in the West Wing, please make your way to the meeting point. And then when you're done, come back here. Okay? Thank you. Thank you.